I know we're all looking forward to hearing from Dr. Jim Miller. Thank you so much.
Thank you. Thank you, Patricia. Thank you, Chris. On the Americans for Prosperity matter, do sign up on that. What AFP does is get out and make sure politicians understand what ordinary folks are thinking, common folks are thinking. As President Reagan used to say, if you can't make elected officials see the light, you have to make them feel the heat. AFP makes them feel the heat. And that's why I'm proud to be with them. Thank you, Pat, for that kind introduction. You know, it's always a pleasure for Damaris and me to come and talk about the greatest president of the 20th century. I want you to welcome my wife. I don't know if you know, my wife Damaris was the Republican nominee against Democratic Congressman Jim Moran in 1998 and in the year 2000. She did a splendid job. Stand up, Damaris, and wave at people. We don't know each other all that well. We've only been married 51 years. She was 18 and I was 19 when we got married. In a fit of exasperation, her father once said, "Neither one of you amount to anything." And we took that as a challenge. So Dr. Damaris Miller and I have, I think, more than met expectations. Anyway, the notion that Ronald Reagan is the greatest president of the 20th century is no idle boast. A few years ago, the Gallup organization asked people who they thought the greatest president was. 22% said Abraham Lincoln. 22% said John Kennedy. 18% said Franklin Delano Roosevelt. 24% said Ronald Reagan. Now, you remember how the press disparaged Ronald Reagan? Thought he was kind of a little slow and, couldn't keep up, made a lot of mistakes, told the same story more than once. As Damaris pointed out to me, I hadn't thought of it quite the same way, Reagan taught in parables. And when they didn't get the message, the first time, he'd tell it again. So there was a method in what he was doing. But it was wonderful to be part of his administration. And as time went on, people began to realize, the man's got a lot more smarts than we thought, especially the media when they saw him be so successful. Kind of reminds me of that old line, that, when I was young, my parents were dolts, but as I got older, they seemed to mature, A lot of this came, and this is an interesting thing to me, how Reagan was so reluctant to take credit about things. He had a little plaque on his desk that said, something to the effect, you'd be amazed how much you can accomplish if you don't mind who gets the credit. I remember one time sitting in front of him, talking about parts of the budget, and I said, Mr. President, I think we ought to demonopolize and privatize the Postal Service. He said, Jim, that sounds like a good idea. Now, years later, I found out something really interesting. Annalise Anderson and Marty Anderson, who knew the president for a long time, they were at the Hoover Institution, were approached by Karen Skinner, who was a professor on leave from Carnegie Mellon University. And she had access to a lot of Reagan's personal papers at the library. And she came across a box with these long yellow legal pad papers. She didn't know what they were. She took them to Annalise and to Marty and said, "What are these?" They looked at her and said, "My God, those are his radio addresses." Now you remember after he lost the nomination in '76 to President Ford, he went back to California and he got on the lecture circuit and he did these radio scripts. You remember those? He was on the radio once or twice a week, regularly. Now, when I was in D.C., you ask anybody in the media, they said, "Oh yeah, he had speechwriters do all that." Well, they published a book entitled "In His Own Hand," because every one of those scripts had been written out by Ronald Reagan in his own hand. So people underestimated. Now, why Reagan didn't put some of these folks down by saying, "You don't know, I've got a box here of all these things I wrote," I think it must be reflective of the fact that he liked to be underestimated. He liked being underestimated. He didn't want to take too much credit for things. Ronald Reagan was clearly a great president. The words of that greatest of all post-World War II, certainly, British Prime Ministers, Baroness Margaret Thatcher, "Ronald Reagan won the Cold War without firing a shot." You must have heard about it. I was there when she said it. It was at the Four Seasons Hotel in Washington, D.C. It was at a Heritage Foundation event. The place went nuts when she said that, not surprisingly. And of course, I suspect everyone here tonight will revere her memory and really regret her passing. She was a very close friend of President Reagan. She was clearly the most important foreign leader as far as President Reagan was concerned. But that rule was reciprocal. At one point, Madam Thatcher, Prime Minister Thatcher, said of Ronald Reagan, "He's the second most important man in my life." That says a lot, doesn't it? Well, in addition, Ronald Reagan put the economy on the longest peacetime expansion in history. And perhaps most importantly, he restored America's faith in itself. Now, how did he accomplish this? What were the characteristics of the man that led to all this success? I believe there were several, that they were interwoven, and that all were important. First was his humility. When speaking about public issues, the context was not I, it was always we, as in we the people. In dealing with the press and with others, he was always polite and accommodating, even to Sam Donaldson. Right after the market collapse in 1987, you remember that? Black Monday? He went out to get on the helicopter to go Camp David. They were shouting, and Donaldson shouting more than anybody else. And they said, "What are you going to do about the market? 500 points down, so on and so on." He said, "Well, markets rise and markets fall." Got on the plane, got on the helicopter, and went off. I asked him one time, what was his theory about about the Cold War? He said, very simple. We win and they lose. He never thought of the presidency as his. He was always an honor to serve the American people for a short time and then return to public life. I recall his telling me twice in 1988, "Jim, I'm going back to California. I'm going back to the ranch." I mean, here's the most powerful man in all the world looking forward to transfer of power, give it up to the American people's choice, going back to California. And he did. Now, unlike President Truman, he didn't board a train down at Union Station, but he was very modest about the way he retired. And finally, there was a letter in 1994 telling his fellow Americans about his Alzheimer's. Very sad. This humility also made Reagan approachable and engaging. He loved listening to people and exchanging views. In a room, he was more likely to pick out for conversation the person who had been overlooked. I saw this. Recall the picture of the fellow at Reagan's lying in state on Capitol Hill. There was a fellow, the line snaked out of the building all down the line, It was a hot day in June, and they were handing out bottles of water and all that stuff. And finally this guy had gone by there, and he stepped aside about 20 feet or so, and he stood there and he saluted. He was wearing tennis shoes, white socks, not black socks, white socks, shorts, and an American flag t-shirt. Now, the people in the liberal media made fun of this guy. Can you believe it? They made fun of him all across America. His picture was all across America. I guarantee you, if Reagan would have been there, he's the guy Reagan had gone over and talked to. Want to know what he thought. He also loved to banter with people who didn't agree with him, including House Speaker Tip O'Neill. A second reason for Reagan's success is that he had extraordinary trust, and he had extraordinary trust in the goodness and the good sense of the American people. And we felt that bond of trust. He loved to say, you won't go wrong trusting the American people. He appreciated the good work that governments can do, but he was wary of concentrating too much power in Washington. He was fond of pointing out that the so-called constitutions of totalitarian states, now think about this, the constitutions of totalitarian states, they all tell what? They tell the people what rights they have. But he says our Constitution, it tells what rights the government has. Very different concept. Like most Americans, he believed there was a right and a wrong in the world, and in the 1980s, the greatest wrong was totalitarian communism. That's the reason he was so fixed. By the way, I was privileged to be a member. Now this may seem this may be kind of scary. Are you ready for something scary? I was a member of the National Security Council. But I heard Reagan say several times when people say, well, no, Mr. President, you can't do that. Oh, no, that's not the right way to do it. Oh, we don't do it. He said, if the Soviets want to wage a Cold War, it's a war they will not win. We win, they lose. Like most Americans, third reason for success is that Reagan would focus on overarching goals with laser precision. As a member of the National Security Council, what I just told you, and just mention a tax increase in his presence, and he would remind you firmly that would be counterproductive. It might also be a career shortener, you know what I mean? And when he was forced to compromise with Congress, this is important, he'd privately say to some, publicly to others, thanks for the half a loaf. I'll be back next year for the other half. And of course he was successful in getting what he wanted in part because he was the great communicator. I once asked the head of the White House Communications Office how it was to do this job for President Reagan. Piece of cake was the answer. Fourth, one thing that sustained Reagan and most everyone else was his sense of humor. In one of his first cabinet meetings, the topic was whether he should allow commercial development in our pristine wilderness areas. Now, almost everybody around the table, this was before I was a cabinet member, I was just observing them. Almost everybody said that was a good idea. But some things he said kind of tipped off that he was not inclined to go along. Finally, the Secretary of Energy, you remember the first Secretary of Energy? Jim Edwards. Jim Watt was Interior, Secretary of Interior. Jim Edwards said, finally, and Jim, Jim Edwards is from South Carolina, so I grew up in Georgia. It's not too hard for me to put on a South Carolina drawl. You know what I mean? He said, Mr. President, I still don't understand why it takes cleaner air for bears than for us humans. Without missing a beat, Reagan went back and said, Jim, you ever smelled a bear? Oh, one time he was about to step from behind the curtain to go out to give a speech. I was with him. And it was this tremendous crowd, very loud, boisterous. He never seemed to he was always calm and focused. He said, Jim, you know the last thing you do before you go out on stage? And I'm thinking, oh my gosh, this is a test. I said, go to the bathroom? He said, close. He said, check your fly. Always check your fly. Or when he and his staff would be waiting for something, the way he'd start calling a baseball game like he did at WHO in Des Moines, Iowa. Remember, right after college? He called a baseball game. Now, you have to realize, the way they called the baseball games then was through teletype. You know what a teletype machine is? You're just getting these abbreviations and all that stuff. So that somebody would be sort of doing a shorthand what's going on. And then the color commentator there at the radio station, namely Ronald Reagan, would make up the story about how it was all doing, describing all the action, etc. Well, one day the teletype broke. And so he had to continue on and calling the game based on his things he made up. There were arguments between managers and umpires. There was a rain delay. Someone ran out on the field. I don't know whether that was before streaking, I guess. So until the teletype resumed, and he had to make up very quickly the innings, explain how the innings went by so fast and how the score had changed. Reagan didn't reserve his humor for Americans only. At one summit, he loved to tell these leaders these stories. I mean, he was right there with Gorbachev, and he told Gorbachev, he said that had it on high authority that Gorbachev was out at his dacha one day and was called back to the Kremlin very fast. And so he grabbed his driver, they jumped in the car and took off, and Gorbachev got very frustrated because his driver wasn't driving fast enough, and he told him to pull over. And he changed places with his drivers, and they took off. And as they entered the outskirts of Moscow, 2 motorcycle policemen spotted him and took off after the car and pulled it over. One of them went up to the window while the other one stayed back ready to go, you know. All of the friend that went to the window came back kind of visibly shaken. He said, well, what's the matter? Who was that? He says, I don't know who it was, but it had Gorbachev as the driver. Now Reagan just reveled in telling these kind of stories, right? And Gorbachev really laughed at that. I mean, it's kind of hard to tell Brezhnev that kind of story, you know. The president could joke even under very scary circumstances, as when he was in the hospital after being shot. When distraught First Lady burst in the emergency room, he said, honey, I forgot to duck. Just before his doctors operated, he says, I hope you are all Republicans, to which the lead physician said, today, Mr. President, we're all Republicans. And Michael Reagan told us this story. Michael, when the president was shot that April, Michael and Maureen were in California, and Ronnie Jr. and Patty were in New York. They got down that afternoon, but they sent a plane for the other two, and they came overnight. The next morning, Michael is in GW Hospital with the president, talking to the president. And he said, Michael, he says, you know, Nancy had this really nice suit made for me. It was this blue suit. Yes, Dad, I understand, yeah. she had it made for me and gave it to me, and I really treasured that suit. Yes, Daddy. Yeah. You know, when it says when they brought me in here, they cut that suit off me. In fact, it was down under the gurney. He said, yes, Dad, I know. He says, you know that young fellow, that mixed up young fellow that shot me? He says, I understand he has a nice family. I said, yeah, yes, Dad, nice family. He says, I understand they're pretty well off, too. I guess pretty nice. He had a shot. He says, yes, Dad, I understand. He says, do you think they might buy me a new suit? Or even later, when he was speaking at an event, Damaris and I were both there. He was dedicating the headquarters of the Republican Senatorial Trust there on right off Capitol Hill. They had blocked off and had bleachers up and all that. And he was speaking and had a podium there, balloons, everything, really thin. So he was there, and he was about halfway through his speech, and all of a sudden one of the balloons right next to the microphone popped away. Pow! Like that. First lady I thought was going to jump out of her skin. Reagan said, miss me? Now, a final reason for President Reagan's success was he had a deep, abiding faith in God and a belief that he was put here for a purpose, especially after the assassination attempt. As he wrote in his diary about that day, getting shot hurts. I mean, he does, immediately, notice the way he writes, the way he communicates. Immediately you're grabbed. Yeah, I bet it does hurt. Still, my fear was growing that because no matter how hard I tried to breathe, it seemed I was getting less and less air. I focused on that tile ceiling and prayed. But I realized I couldn't ask for God's help, while at the same time I felt hatred for the mixed up young man who had shot me. Isn't that the meaning of the lost sheep? We are all God's children and therefore equally beloved by Him. I began to pray for his soul and that he would find his way back to the fold. Whatever happens now, I owe my life to God and will try to serve Him in every way I can. Now, as an aside, let me suggest, if you haven't, pick up a copy of this book, Rawhide Down. Has anybody here read it? Really, Damaris says, you really should read that. It's by Washington Post reporter Del Quentin Wilbur. And I got in on the end of a little presentation he was giving one day, but I had to leave. I didn't get to meet him. But it's really well done, and it's really, really worth your taking a look at. You know, I am often asked what Ronald Reagan would do about the fiscal mess we're in today. Now, bear in mind that Reagan's economic philosophy was well grounded long before he became president. Reagan was an economics major in college. Did you know that? Eureka College. He was trained in classical economics. He was no Keynesian. And in fact, he purposely, I allege purposely, mispronounced Keynes's name. Here I come on the director of OMB, member of the Inside Group, etc., meeting with the president, the Oval Office, etc. We're discussing big ideas, etc. And he said something about, I don't go along with this fella Keynes. This guy Keynes is no good. I mean, I don't believe him. So I said, Mr. President, I'm just showing off, because I used to be a college professor. You're probably shocked to that, too. I used to be an economics professor. And I said, actually, it's pronounced Keynes. John Maynard Keynes, like a walking cane. John Maynard Keynes. So, not 3 or 4 weeks later, we're sitting around talking about so-and-so, and he talked about this guy Keynes. I mean, all people on the Hill just think John Maynard, this guy Keynes, they're followers of Keynes. And I said, oh, no, Mr. President, it's John, it's like a walking cane, Keynes, A little while later, we were talking about it, and he mentioned Keynes again. I said, Jim, you better keep your trap shut. You You've said enough. So I did. Reagan had faith in the American people. He believed that people would make the right decisions in free markets. He believed the role of government was to establish the rules of the game, or rules of the road, but that entrepreneurship and hard work lead to economic plenty, progress, and growth. Policies based on his philosophy produce results. Recall the economy in the late 1970s was in the doldrums, and then he had an economic Dunkirk at the beginning of the 1980s. In response, Reagan propounded a program with 4 specific elements: tax cuts, spending restraint, regulatory relief, and a stable monetary policy. Remember those? The result was a quick recovery by the 84-85, and was the longest peacetime expansion in U.S. history. Now the current situation is one where we find ourselves in a financial meltdown. I notice people cupping their ears. So, can you hear all right, or is that anemic GDP growth, falling prices of large assets, real estate especially, rising prices for fuel and food, contraction in natural wealth, persistent and high unemployment, and feelings of alienation and lack of hope. And the current policies, we have massive spending to put people back to work. I was just talking with somebody a while ago. These programs to put people back haven't done that. Every time you put people work here, somebody else loses a job here. Been punitive tax policies driven by equity concerns, bailouts of enterprises and personnel too big to fail, imposition of crushing regulations to achieve social goals, and using the Federal Reserve in various schemes leading to vacillating monetary policy, all driven by a redistributive ethic. This is not what Ronald Reagan would do. Here's what I think he would do. First, he'd remind us of the principle that should drive economic policy: establish the rules within which citizens seek to serve their own interests, and then step back and let markets work. He'd also explain that actions have consequences. Don't expect the government to bail you out. That the money you earn is yours, not the government's. That often government is the problem, not the solution. And that governmental institutions are best when they are stable and predictable. Within that framework, he'd cut discretionary spending and then freeze it as a percentage of GDP. He'd reform so-called entitlement programs. He'd cut Social Security, elevate the retirement age, and change the index for spending on this item, but not change the index for tax rates. There are some hidden tax increases in this budget that the administration has forwarded. He'd repeal Obamacare and place it with interstate medical insurance, tort reform, medical savings accounts, and a copay for Medicaid. He'd also reform agriculture programs to end farming of the federal government. He would control runaway corporate subsidies such as Solyndra. He'd reform the tax code by making taxes more transparent and replacing the crazy quilt of IRS rules and regulations with a flat tax. How many of you have seen the speech or read the speech? You know what I'm talking about? The speech he gave on behalf of Barry Goldwater a couple of weeks before the election in '64. If you haven't, you ought to go to YouTube and put in Reagan's speech for Goldwater or something like that. Time for choosing. I mean, the flat tax, all of it's there. I mean, it's there. If you want to know what Reagan believed, look at that. And so people were surprised when he began to try to carry out those things. And he would make it clear that everyone had skin in the game and thus wouldn't demand so much increased spending. Now, a lot of people we know, Scott Hodge and his people at the Tax Foundation have covered that about 50% of all taxpayers, filers, don't pay income tax. You know that, don't you? About half of them. And that's in a way what Governor Romney was talking about in that 47% comment, et cetera. But the fact really is that even people who don't pay income tax pay a lot of taxes, because every federal tax has an incidence that affects consumers. And if we had a much more transparent system and had simplified taxes, had just simply a flat tax on income, or even a flat tax on sales, the fair tax, people would know they have a stake in what the federal government does, and they would be less inclined to go along with whatever the federal government wants to spend. It's unfortunate, but it's true that the tax code is so complicated, people don't understand it. You know, around April 15th of every year, people in the media will call up IRS hotlines and local people who do tax returns and give them a little fact situation and get different answers from everyone. How do you know? I was on TV early this week and I was saying, you know, filing your income tax imposes enormous psychological cost and probably physical cost emanating from the psychological cost. You don't know when you do your taxes whether somebody's going to come knock on your door and claim that you were violating federal income tax laws and so forth. Why to have something so complicated? Doesn't make sense to me. Reagan would place a permanent ceiling on government revenue, such as 20% of GDP, and refused to sign an increase in the debt limit until institutions were in place to assure a balanced budget. He'd take the Federal Reserve out of the business of micromanaging the economy by offloading its holdings of mortgage-backed securities, treasuries, and most other liquid assets, and he'd replace the multiple Fed goals with a single one: price stability. He'd harness the regulatory agencies and change their direction by rewriting the regulatory agency statutes to require benefit-cost analysis, strengthening centralized regulatory review to offset the propensity of agencies to crank out endless regulations. I used to say, I thought maybe, you know, it kind of impressed people. That's the raison d'etre of regulatory agencies is to issue regulations. Weren't you impressed with that? I mean, a little bit of French there. I mean, isn't that French or is that Latin? I don't know. But raison d'etre. But they do. It's like Congress. They feel like they're failures if they don't pass laws doing something. My friend Murray Wiedenbaum says, why don't you hurry up and undo something? Under the dictum, the private sector does it better, Reagan would return all companies that were Obamanized to private ownership. Plus, he'd privatize Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac and the U.S. Postal Service. Now, I have to tell you a story. I have to tell you about this. It is tradition. First of all, I was called by someone at the Bush 43 White House, said, the President wants you to go on the Board of Governors of the Postal Service. The Postal Service has a Board of Governors, which is just like a Board of Directors of a company. But instead of being selected by the stockholders, they are selected or nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate. I said, what? Says, yeah, I want you to go on the, I says, you know who you're talking to? I'm the one that proposed demonopolizing and privatizing the Postal Services. You know, very controversial thing, etc. He said, yes, he knows that, but he knows that you know a lot about government and a lot about business, and he thinks that you could lead that. So I ended up agreeing, and that ended up being nominated and confirmed. So when I'm on the Board of Governors, they elect a chairman. The members of the board elect a chairman. I was elected chairman for 3 years. And it is tradition that when a president dies, if they can issue a stamp on the next birthday, if they have time to get it together, they will issue the stamp in honor of that president on the president's what would have been his next birthday. Well, President Reagan's birthday is in February, and he died in June, so it's plenty of time. So that was the stamp we produced, and put out, and it was really went very, very well. And but within about 2 years, 18 months, we raised the price of the stamp from 37 cents to 39 cents. I got a call from somebody in New York who had been in the Reagan White House. I can't even remember who it was. Said, Jim, why don't you issue a new stamp? A 39-cent stamp looks just the same, just 39 cents. I said, you know, I hadn't thought about that. I don't think it's ever done, but I'm going to check into it. So I checked it. Oh, no, we don't do it. We never, oh, no. That was it. We never reissue stamp. Never reissue stamp. No way. We never reissue stamp. I said, I understand. So at the next board meeting, at some point, I said, you know, we've had a 37-cent Reagan stamp. We didn't have it all that long, and it really went well, and I think we ought to have a 39-cent stamp. Just same thing, same portrait, everything, just a 39-cent. Oh, some of the people jump up. Oh, no, we can't do that. Never. I said, do I have a motion? And I did. Do I have a second? I did. I said, all in favor say aye. Aye. All opposed? We have a 39-cent stamp. Reagan stamp. Now, then I call Mrs. Reagan, I call out to the Reagan Library to tell Joanne Drake, who was chief of staff, or who was heading the thing that time, about this. And she was just delighted. And she says, well, don't you want to tell Mrs. Reagan yourself? I said, I don't want to bother her. She says, oh, no, we'll put you through. We'll put you through. I said, well, okay. So put me through. Well, Mrs. Reagan got on. Mrs. Reagan, this is Jim Miller, and so forth. Yeah, Jim, how are you doing? I said, well, I'm in the Postal Service. And, you know, we had the Reagan stamp, and it was really well received, and we changed the price of the stamp. We had decided to reissue the stamp as a 39-cent stamp. She was so excited, and she was so happy, and I said, well, you know, Mrs. Reagan, one of the reasons we did this is because it was the second fastest selling stamp in all of Postal Service history. Oh, no. No. Oh, Jim, you didn't say that. Yeah, I did. Well, Jim, what was the fastest selling stamp? Elvis. She laughed. But then, on the anniversary, what would have been the anniversary, it would have been Reagan's 100th birthday, there was a joint resolution from Congress, signed by the President Obama, establishing a commission to commemorate Reagan's life and his contributions, and there were various events throughout the country held, etc. One of the things they suggested was another stamp, unprecedented. I thought it was a really good idea. So, long story, a lot of people contributed that, etc., but we ended up with a new stamp. Damaris got one on her lapel here. No, the other side, Damaris. In any event, I knew when I went out to the Reagan Library to help dedicate that stamp, I knew that we were going to make it a forever stamp. But it would have been irresponsible for me to say it. We had one already, the little Liberty Bell. Remember that one? And by the way, getting that approved and through the Postal Service was no easy thing. But I worked my magic again with my fellow governors, and we got it. Now, so I'm up there speaking and talking about the stamp and dedicating the stamp, and Mrs. Reagan is there, and it just came to me. I said, you know, this is a wonderful stamp, so forth and so on. And if you know, if I get my way, this is going to be a forever stamp. Place went wild. And guess what? It became a forever stamp. Also, Reagan would quit bashing free enterprise. He'd recognize the superiority of growth over redistribution, and he'd force the rules of the road fairly but firmly, or firmly but fairly. With all that in mind, let me address a few other matters. How much time I got?
You're fine.
Okay. I'm an old college professor. I keep going. Let me address a few vexing policy issues that I think important, if for no other reason that preoccupation with them has slowed down congressional attention on some of these fiscal matters that are so important. First is a really big one, adherence to the U.S. Constitution. Every employee of the U.S. government has to swear to preserve, protect, and defend the Constitution. Some of you are employees of the federal government or have been in the service, you have to do that. Indeed, the oath is prescribed for the President in Section 1 of Article 2 of the Constitution. So why is this Constitution ignored, if not purposely violated, by so many in office? Let me tell you what really scares me. The prominence and thinly veiled approval given by the mainstream media to the musings of some Georgetown law professor to the effect that the President and others should simply ignore the Constitution and do what is right. I mean, people ought to be outraged by this. If the Constitution needs to be changed, the founders incorporated in the Constitution a means for changing it. In fact, we've changed it 27 times, 18 if you count the Bill of Rights as one change. The Constitution is the supreme law of the land and ought to be respected and cherished. Here's another example, the ballyhoo over sequestration. You think that the world's come to an end. This year, we've heard that the airport security officials will be cut and long lines will ensue. Tours of the White House have been suspended. Meat and poultry inspectors have been laid off. Airport traffic control centers have been closed. National parks have not opened. Damaris and I went up to Skyline Drive. Remember that comet that came through a few weeks ago? We went up there so we can see it down near the horizon. Got up there and it was closed. So we went over the peak, went down the other side in Luray. We couldn't find a place to see it. There was another ridge, so we went up the other ridge. Came on down the Shenandoah Valley. The best place we could find to watch the comet was from the parking lot of a McDonald's. We were there in a McDonald's next to the I-81 because they wouldn't open the dadgum Skyline Drive. Purchases of ammunition be suspended. U.S. fleets have been recalled. Navy's Blue Angels have been grounded. Illegal immigrants won't be apprehended or returned. Social security checks won't go out. The Russians have to be depended upon to send our astronauts into space, to the space station. Prisoners have to be released because we can't take care of them. And you could add your own examples. You've heard them, Now, I admit there are much better ways of reducing spending than with sequestration. But how do you get members of the Congress and President to do that? It's clear the administration put itself in a box on this issue rather than offering guarantees to guarantee sensible cuts in spending. They came back to Congress with promises of spending cuts and definite increase in taxes. How many times did I hear President Reagan say, I had a deal with Tip O'Neill right out of that apple tree out there. We walked out there and talked, and we had a deal. He was going to cut $3 for spending for every dollar tax increase I had in that 82 budget. And we got the taxes, he got the tax, I got none of the cuts. I think it'd be a mistake to fall for that. I'd stick with a sequester. First, the amount of spending eliminated is a small fraction of the total. Like any family has to live within their means. Government can do the same. We've had sequesters before, hardly anybody noticed. We've had these shutdowns before. I was once in the Oval Office with the President. We had one of those times where, ended appropriations. You had to have a continuing resolution to go forward. And there was a gap there. And I was walking back and forth. I was upset because, I felt really like I'd failed the President some way because They thought that he'd go along with a tax increase. I said, absolutely not. No way, Jose, no tax increase. So I was walking back and forth. Finally, he just put his hand on my shoulder and said, Jim, just settle down. Let's close her down and see if anybody notices. Well, in any event, this is a Washington Monument game. You know what the Washington Monument game is. You know, the president gets the whole cabinet together and says, all right, spending too much money, your proposed budget's too high. Everybody go back, prioritize, we'll meet tomorrow. You come in and tell me what you can do without, you know. Cut down to low priorities. Right, they go around the table. The Secretary of Interior says, Mr. President, I've looked high and low and so forth, and the only thing I'd figure out that we could do is we close down the Washington Monument. That's called the Washington Monument game. Third, the tax code should be simplified and made transparent, as I had said. One reason there's so much confusion about taxes is they're so complicated. People can't understand them. Political decision makers also mess up when it comes to initiatives that may sound right to some constituents but are counterproductive in their effects. Take, for example, an increase in minimum wage. No doubt some benefits, but those workers whose marginal, economists talk about marginal revenue products lower than the minimum wage will not be able to take a job. Rent controls are counterproductive to the nation's housing stock. Energy, does it make sense if you, depending on foreign oil and have all these complications, that you block the Keystone Pipeline or block oil exploration in Alaska? Doesn't seem to me. Throw away money in sunlight batteries, wind turbines, and battery-powered cars before their time. We need more truth-telling in budgeting. When people in the media and most politicians talk about cutting spending, you know what they're doing? Talking about? They're talking about spending less than a baseline, which is established, which incorporates all the spending presently in the current law, adjusted for increases in population, inflation, everything else. When you sit down with your spouse at the kitchen table, say, honey, we've got to cut spending, you mean to spend less next week than you spent this week, less next month than you spent this month, less next year than you spent this year, right? That's not what they're talking about. In fact, when they come out, and then they also inflate it by talking about 10-year numbers. I can tell you, as a former budget director, you can have some confidence in your forecast for next year and a little bit of confidence in your forecast for 2 years, but out 3 years and out, you're just guessing. I mean, they're guessing. And of course, they want to pump up the numbers, make it look big, for whatever argument they're trying to make. In any event, so when they talk about deep cuts, they're typically talking about increases, but not as big an increase as they wanted. That's what they call a cut. So a third example is trust funds. We talked briefly about trust funds out there. It's a fiction. There's no safety box. It's all a fiction. It's IOUs on current generations to to current generation, future generations. Let me move on to a matter of some controversy about which I've given some thought: immigration. Now, I wrote this sometime 6 or 8 months ago. I've been of this view for at least a couple of years. And let me note outright that I sat in the Oval Office and pleaded with President Reagan to veto the '86 immigration bill. Why? I thought that the amnesty provisions and all would come about, but the tidying up of our borders and enforcing of our borders would not. And that's what basically happened. All right. But having said that, what we have with the current regime is in economics, what's in economics is called an uneconomic law. That is, the incentives to violate it are just overwhelming. For example, suppose the authorities posted a 10-mile-an-hour speed limit on a stretch of I-66. No one would observe the limit. And even an army of Virginia's finest would not be able to make it stick. The vast majority of illegal aliens are here to make a living for themselves and to send a portion back to their families. That draw is overwhelming. The criminals and those trying to secure U.S. citizenship for their children are the exception. In fact, U.S. citizenship is not a priority for the vast majority of illegal aliens. They simply want to work. I've concluded that a radical revamping of our immigration law is called for. Pending a screening for criminal behavior, everyone here illegally should be made legal. Seasonal workers should be given a green card, and those with full-time employment should be given residency. They should pay taxes and abide by our other laws, and if they fail in this, they should be deported and not readmitted. They should be allowed to vote if and only if they go to the back of the line and become U.S. citizens. Such a program would solve a lot of problems. We'd get more productive labor in this country. There would be tax equity between illegal aliens and workers who are U.S. citizens. There would be an increase in federal revenues, thus lightening the load for concurrent taxpayers. And we could focus resources on apprehending and prosecuting those who really do pose threats to America, drug runners and other criminals. Finally, with respect to legal immigration, we should abandon this mindless preoccupation with diversity and greenlight those with the skills and entrepreneurships that will help our economy. Are you still with me? What about gay marriage? As a Bible-toting Christian, I believe practicing homosexuality is a sin. But are we to disassociate from and discriminate against all sinners? Is there anyone here without sin? If so, please raise your hand. The debate is not over whom do you love, as some people are making the argument, but the question of what legal rights should same-sex partners have. Even though the laws relating to insurance and other advantages for married couples are not written as carefully as I would like, this is not a compelling reason to deny same-sex couples rights similar to those enjoyed by married couples. I would just give the former relationship a different name, union, perhaps. The exception from this, I should note, is the question of adoption. We're parents of an adopted child, and 2 biological, 1 adopted. We have a grandson that's adopted. The resolution should clearly rest on the interest of the children, not the interest of the same-sex couple. A similar logic holds with respect to gays in the military and women in combat. The question should be decided on the basis of what's in the best interest of national security, not the pseudo-rights of the affected military personnel. Let me end by returning to the fiscal outlook. Despite the problems we have over the next several years, I see slow growth in the economy, a slow reduction in the unemployment rate, some contraction in dependency and the cost of the safety net, and slowly rising incomes and consumption. I hasten to add the outlook could be a lot better if the President and Congress were to enact the pro-growth policies that President Reagan would espouse. Moreover, let us not forget that exogenous developments still pose huge risks to our fiscal recovery, not to mention our physical well-being. These include Iran's nuclear program, North Korea's belligerence, possible flare-ups in the South China Sea, reaction to trade retaliation on the part of the U.S., faltering EU and China economic growth, another Boston, Beirut, USS Cole, 9/11, London Tube, or Benghazi incident, cyber war, adversarial orchestrated theft of intellectual property, simple vandalism, or even worse, premeditated attacks on our electric grid and other infrastructure. And finally, and especially, a rise in interest rates, which could take our fiscal crisis to a whole new level. In conclusion, our nation is highly vulnerable to threats from within and without. Let us learn from our mistakes. Let us return to the principles that launched this great nation and that were championed by our greatest president of the 20th century. Let us find the strength and resolve to apply them. Thank you very much. Sure.
If you have any questions, come on over here and get mine. I'm going to give you 2 mics if you hold on. I'm going to hold on to them so you can speak about them.
Okay.
How long do you think our dollar will remain the world's reserve currency?
For the indefinite future, as much as problems as we have, other currencies, potential candidates for that role are having problems too. Look at the euro. The Chinese yuan would not be a good candidate because of the realization that the government does control it so tightly to its interest, to serve its interest. We're in a heck of a pickle, no doubt about it, and we need to straighten it out. Damaris and I last week, were in the Cayman Islands. A former member of the British Parliament, David Shaw, and I did a study at the request of the British government of their financial situation. Now, this is a country whose total GDP and population is like a third of a major American city, but they have the same kinds of problems, but they're dealing with them, and it's more likely they're going to solve them than America's going to solve its problems. But I have confidence that over time, American people will finally have enough. Will realize they've had enough. And I think the trigger will be when we have a substantial increase in the rate of inflation. And if you look at the simple macroeconomics that we're facing today, when people become more confident about the future, they will get off their cash balances and they will start spending faster. And that's going to mean inevitably a rise in price level unless the Fed is willing and able to constrict, to reduce the money base, and the politicians are going to put extreme pressure on them not to do that. So look for that to be a real state of controversy in the next few years, because I suspect we're going to have inflation rearing its ugly head before long.
Hi. I was a little bit surprised at your comments about your current views on immigration. From what I gather, legal and illegal immigrants demand a lot of services, taxpayer-funded services. And at a time when we have, realistically, as you know probably better than I do, 10 to 15% of Americans unemployed, why do we want to take in more poor people into this country who drain more and more of our tax dollars and show no respect for the laws of America, the immigration laws? And what's going to prevent, again, we see the bill out there now, including supported by Rubio, where we don't have enforcement first. It's just, to me, outrageous. It's just a prescription for more economic decline in America and people who have just given up looking for jobs, because Americans will do the job. They may not do it $5 an hour, but they'll do it for 10.
You have a very respectable position, sir, and I'm not, and I take your representation seriously. One thing is that today the illegal immigrants, many are getting the benefits but not paying the taxes. If you changed over to what I was saying, they pay taxes, right? And they would be less competitive with their American cohorts or the indigenous population if they had to pay taxes, or people who paid them to do work had to reflect the higher costs that included taxes. My understanding, have I read this bill? How many is it, 1,200 pages or something? No, I haven't read it. I dare say not more than 5 members of the Senate have read it either. Okay? So, and they're trying to rush it through, which is a big mistake, I think. I think it ought to be analyzed and reviewed and understood. But from what at least Marco Rubio has represented, the path to citizenship would take 15 years, 14 years, something like that. That in the interim they would not be, could not avail themselves of a lot of the benefits that they have now. So and in terms of the employment situation, I think the economy will continue to grow at a very modest rate of increase. But I think that there are much more efficient ways of addressing the unemployment problem than putting an estoppel on these people that want to work.
Hello, I agree with all your positions, but until we address that we're just speaking to the choir, that the media is effectively controlled by the left, and it's corrupted the political process to the point where it's an uneven playing field. Unless we address this, unless we speak out against it, nobody mentions the big elephant. And the big elephant is everything we get from the media is basically, that isn't censored, is outrageous lies. And unless we address this, we'll never pull our country out of its of death spiral.
You got a very good point. And I would say 15 years ago, this was an almost insoluble problem. But it's not today. And the reason is there's so many more venues for news today than there were then. And people are responding. The portion of people that receive their major news from the networks, the mainstream media, have gone down. The listenership for the mainstream media have gone down. The alternatives, Fox Business, and others, have gone gangbusters. And it's because people are making those decisions. On the radio, the radio, it's even more dramatic because the major talk radio stations are on the right, not the left. The right on talk radio dominates far more than dominates the left. So as people began to wake up and understand, they will force a diminution in the influence of the mainstream media, and an increase in the effectiveness and the influence of the more conservative media. The interesting thing is, if you talk with people in the mainstream media, they think that they're really middle of the road. I remember going to give a speech at James Madison University, and I was in a plane. We were flying over there with one of the noted reporters on NBR, and we were talking about it, and I had asked him about the bias, etc. He said, "Absolutely not. We're just right down the middle, right down the middle." I said, "How do you know that you're down the middle? What metric do you use to make that determination?" He says, "Why, when I go to dinner parties, some people on the left of me, some people on the right of me, I'm always getting it hit back from both sides." I said, "Did it ever occur to you the people you go to have dinner with might have a point of view?" They think that that's the one reason they rebel at any notion that they're prejudiced or biased in any way. But over time, the message is getting through. I believe markets work, including markets for information.
Dr. Miller, thank you very much for your service to our country and for your wife's willingness to serve the Commonwealth.
And to stay with me, you know.
Well, that too. That too. But you mentioned the famous Tip O'Neill hoodwinking of Reagan, if you
Right.
will. Could you address a little bit what appeared to be the same situation with Bush 41 and the compromise that ended up breaking the No New Taxes pledge?
I'll tell you two stories, both true. One is that after the 87 market collapse, we went and had sessions with Congress to do a budget deal. And we got fairly close, I guess, but I was not happy. And we went, I won't even use the names, but you can guess who they were. The people that were representing the president in those negotiations, we met with him in the Oval Office. And the others were urging him to sign onto this deal. I said, Mr. President, this is the same thing as you got from Tip O'Neill. And you remember what happened? Boy, it was like a charge I'd set off. He knew exactly. And I told him why. He said, well, boys, we can do a lot better than this. Y'all go back and get some more. So then President Bush, I adore President Bush 41. Here was a guy, what was he, 18 years old, shot down in the Pacific off an island where the Americans they had captured, they had beheaded. I mean, this guy he's a real American hero. He was never given quite the credit he deserved for that. But I think he was given a lot of advice that was bad. And he had some problems with regulatory activity. Whereas he had been chairman of this task force where we reduce the regulatory output, under his administration it came back up. And the National Journal did a cover story on the re-regulatory president, picture of him in the Oval Office, Bush. He called up one of my friends and he said, come down immediately, come down to my office. Come down to the office. He says, is this true? Well, yes, Mr. President, it's true. And he was really not focused on this kind of activity, and it kind of got away from him. So, but that said, I must say I have great admiration for George Bush. And I think in terms of affecting the economy adversely, his son's decisions were far worse. But I have admiration for him as well.
Thank you again so much.